So, hello, everybody. Welcome to the podcast on embracing difference. I am joined here by two of my Preister colleagues, Jane and Toy, who are going to introduce themselves in a moment. But this podcast is really an opportunity to delve into the Embracing Difference Insight Guide that Jane and Toy pulled together. And this is full of valuable information, insights, tools. It's very useful. And we thought it would be a good idea to unpack the thinking in this a little bit today and share it with you. But before we do that, I'd love it if you could introduce yourselves just briefly. So we'll start with you, Toy. Would you tell us a little bit about you and your coaching experience?
Okay, so I'm an executive coach with Preister. I'm a team coach as well and a chartered coaching psychologist. I've always had a particular interest in leadership and have written about people's relationship to power as it can affect their careers. I've written about dynamics and authority in the boardroom and spoken about the accelerating pace of development and of leaders and how they need to meet that complexity in our workplaces. For example, by embracing difference. So that's me in a nutshell.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Toy. And Jane, what about you? Tell us a little bit about your coaching.
Yes, thank you. I've been working as an executive coach for over 20 years now, which has been an interesting journey as it's grown and developed as a profession. I live and work in Spain. So as well as being part of the Preister UK team, I also run Preister in Iberia. So inevitably, I've had a lot of international colleagues. I work on cross-cultural issues. But I suppose in latter years, I've got particularly interested in how leaders manage themselves and therefore their teams in increasingly complex environments with a lot of ambiguity and no specific answer. So that's where I'm focused a lot at the moment.
Great, thank you. And as I said, welcome to both of you. So my first question really is about the topic and what led you to write about this topic. And I'm going to direct that at you, Toy, if you don't mind. Just tell me what piqued your interest.
Well, clients had been approaching us with questions about overload and productivity. How can we optimize decision making? We need to better process for managing conflict. We are running a global team with an international workforce. How can we get better integration across social and cultural divides? How can we support our best brains to be the most productive with the least social friction? And the themes that kept coming up from those kinds of questions were, global business, international workforce, accelerating pace, othering and being othered as a way of coping with that. So that was really the beginning of it. It was client-led.
Mm-hmm. Which is always the best place to start, I guess, when the client raises some challenges that you then follow that thread and find out where it takes you. Now, I know that you did an awful lot of research before you committed to writing, before you sat down to put pen to paper or to plan, the guide in any way, shape, or form. So I wonder if you could just tell me a little bit about the background research that you did and how you got under the skin of this topic, and how it's informed what you then produced.
Yeah, so this, as I say, was client-led. And so as you'd expect, a thorough review of the literature. The question of embracing difference was really driven by these questions we were getting. So the clients were a primary source of the data, what they were actually observing in their international workforce, communicating at pace on complex projects across social differences. And then after analyzing the data in light of the literature, so then that's where the 3-step framework came out of. So it's about recognizing on the one hand and then knowing what to do about it on the other hand. Jane lives in Spain, and she brought a really significant and versatile, piece of her experience to this as a sounding board, completely unbelievably generous, certainly from the perspective of the international users of this. We had quite a few challenging conversations along the way, and eventually we presented the whole thing to colleagues to run it as a pilot. We took their feedback and we refined it to what it is today.
And so when you did all that research, can you tell me what some of the key findings were that you stumbled across? What were some of the insights that you gleaned? And can you share a couple of those with us, perhaps?
Well, I think the most important thing was people recognizing, what the situation is showing them. So, for example, one of the things that we found was that whether people were doing the othering, as it were, and whether they were on the receiving end of it, both sides it was led by fear, fear that they lose something or that they were losing something. And that was the underlying thing, really. That was the main takeaway, to see that this was being driven by that. And also being able to recognize it very concretely. What are we actually looking at? Is it, what we think it is, or is it just somebody being hypersensitive? And then what do we do about it? So there were 3 steps: recognize it, being able to label it, and then what do we do about it? So those are the 3 things, really.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you, Toy. And I've got another question for you. I'm going to come to you, Jane, in a second. So I've got another question for you, which is, really, can you tell us why it's so important to understand this topic, and why now? Why it's so, kind of top of mind now? Why it's such an important topic for us to address right now?
Yeah, well, for individuals and organizations, like I said, they brought all those kinds of questions. So it's important that people work together. We are working, with organizations that need to be productive. For organizations, they wanted to know, like I said before, how to optimize decision making, how to equip people to manage conflict better, how to create cultures that are highly productive with the least social friction. And for the leaders, it's about being able to recognize the cultures that is forming underneath their nose and being able to recognize and label it. And, to do what is needed to support their people so that they can embrace difference and change when things get uncertain. Those are the main things, really. I think that there's an urgent need to have cultures that work, especially when we are in a situation where there's accelerated change and uncertainty.
It's interesting, you talked about social friction there, and I'm guessing that's quite important, as opposed to friction in a different context, or conflict or disagreement. So could you just expand on that a little bit and explain the concept of social friction?
Well, social friction is about what people do when they're trying to negotiate each other's values, beliefs, and behaviors. Whereas something like intellectual friction is fantastic. We want people to have that intellectual friction. We like that. So the social friction is about how do we communicate across our differences, and we want that to be as much out of the way as possible, so that we can actually say what we mean and be understood in that way. Mm.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Jane, I'm wondering whether, from your experience, there is an example maybe that you could share that would help bring this to life for us. So, we've talked a little bit about some of the theory here, but I'm wondering whether you've got, a case study that would help illustrate some of this, perhaps.
Yeah, sure. So there was a woman I worked with a few years ago, very talented, very bright. She had a stellar academic career and a very successful early career. And then she was working in quite a male-dominated environment, a sort of engineering context. And she had a boss who was clearly both used to and preferred working with men. And as a result, the messaging she got was, "You'll never amount to anything because you're a woman." And it was almost as blatant as that. And the consequence was that she really couldn't do anything right. She couldn't get her voice heard. She wasn't invited to participate. She was overlooked in, projects and things. So when Toy says, the clients really want to have a better functioning, more efficient environment, here you had this amazingly talented woman who really couldn't do anything right in the environment in which she was working. And the problem then, of course, is that, she almost started to believe it.
And then it's very undermining, because it affects, your confidence and everything, doesn't it? It kind of, yeah. Okay, I'm going to ask you to help define some words that Toy used, and she threw them out there, and I sort of they didn't get past me, and I was thinking, okay, we need a little bit of clarity and definition around what othering is and what it is to be othered, what being othered is. So I wonder if you could help make that really clear for all of us.
Okay. So the way that we've used this language is that somebody who is othering is the person who is demonstrating the behavior towards somebody else that is making them feel excluded because of their difference. So they would be othering. The person being othered is like the client I've just described, who is on the receiving end of these behaviors.
Now, it's interesting because I remember we did an exercise as coaches when we were together where the question I think you posed to us is, have you ever been part of a group that you didn't really feel part of? And I think that's such a brilliant question because we can all remember whether it's, part of a team at work, or it could be a sports team, or it could be in a social situation or whatever. We've all felt sort of out of place, like we don't belong, like we don't fit in. So that's the kind of thing that we're alluding to, that feeling that I'm not meant to be here. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Or I'm not part of this.
Yes. And when it's something that we're talking about, dealing with specifically through this 3-stage framework, it's where it's a very deliberate set of behaviors persistently demonstrated, which are making somebody feel that because of the difference that they represent in that particular group. So, you'll remember, Vonnie, when we did these exercises, people came up with all sorts of elements of themselves that made them different in a particular context. So it can be many things, but the end result is that somebody is not able to contribute. They're being held back because of these persistent behaviors that are deliberate. They're deliberately trying to harm somebody else or limit their ability to perform in their role.
And so I guess, you were talking about the fact that this is kind of an ongoing behavior. How can we recognize those patterns that sort of reinforce othering or being othered? What is it that might give us an indication that it's that versus, again, Toy mentioned hypersensitivity. So how do we separate those two things?
And it's important to separate them. So some of the things that you might notice where somebody is being othered would be they're being ignored. They're being deliberately excluded from conversations, projects, meetings, whatever. Their contribution is minimized. It may be that when they say something, it's ignored, but somebody else can say exactly the same thing, and it's sort of leapt on with great enthusiasm. You'll get a misuse of humor sometimes, and then it's, they can't take a joke and all this. But we all recognize when something isn't really a joke, when there's an edge to it. So they can be on the receiving end of that. There can be great generalizations based on a particular group. And that can be everything from got the wrong accent, you come from a particular cultural group, it can be religious groups, anything like that. You can have gone to the wrong school. We all know that those groups are there, and that generalization can be used to highlight difference and therefore be the point of the lightning rod going in, if you like. So those would be some of the things that you'd notice.
So it can be the way you speak or anything like that that can single you out as different or whatever. And for that, for whatever reason, makes you less credible or less, likely to be heard or included in something.
Very much so, because people will associate wrongly generalized sort of behaviors around a particular accent.
And when might it be oversensitivity? So when might it be, almost that I'm bringing my own, kind of prejudices to this or something like that? When might that be the case?
I think one of the big differences there is that somebody is it's not that people are deliberately targeting them, but rather that they are taking a lot of different normal rough and tumble in normal life and making more of it because they're not able to cope with it. So it's not a deliberate set of behaviors targeted at them. That would be an indicator. They get upset about more things than one particular. I think or lack of confidence, so they don't put themselves forward enough. We know these are all things that need to be supported. But it's not othering.
Okay, and you talk in the guide about the inevitable paradox. Is that the thing? Is that the sort of the balance that you need to understand the between hypersensitivity and othering? Is that the meaning behind that?
No, the inevitable paradox is about intention, actually.
Right.
Because what we also noticed is, and we had an example of one person who came from a particular cultural group in this case, who really wanted to reach out and build a bridge between somebody from another social group where there was quite a lot of tension. And so their intention was really good. But the other person was horrified and absolutely rejected out of hand the overture and was quite offended by it. So the paradox is that there are behaviors which can appear to be othering if they're perceived in that way. But you have to look at intention as well.
Okay.
Because in this case, the intention was really good, but it was misconstrued or rejected, whatever.
Yeah. And so as a leader, what can you do if you observe these behaviors happening around you? I know Toy referenced the cultures that we, kind of work in and exist in. So as a leader, what's your role in this, assuming that you're not in the mix and actually part of this? Toy, would you like to answer that?
Well, what the leader can do is to listen to both sides and so that both sides are heard. That's a really important thing that they can do. And I suppose just try and support the individuals as best they can. I mean, I do think that once they've decided that othering is in fact happening or not happening, that they can have one of the three types of conversations that we've talked about, which is about exploring what the beliefs are, and so on. Yeah.
Great. Okay. And Toy, do you have any examples maybe where it isn't quite clear if a person's being hypersensitive or whether maybe othering is going on? Have you got any kind of, again, an example that you could illustrate that for us with?
Well, there was a fellow called James who grew up. I'll just say that he was a white male and grew up in social housing estates, which was pretty much a new area where education was discouraged and there was a lot of crime as well. But he made his way through a variety of social mobility schemes and he learned to use cutlery. I know it sounds basic, but yes, he did learn to use cutlery and play golf. And he is now the chief investment officer. Now, of course, he didn't get rid of his accent, and he was keenly aware that when he spoke differently from his colleagues, and he also thought in a different way from his colleagues.
Yes.
And he ended up having major battles, actually, with some of them because they just didn't see eye to eye. So one of the questions there was, is that him being hypersensitive, or was it were they being fair to him? So rather than focusing on the discussion, which was a discussion of how should the policy work, they were teasing about his accent and claiming that his closest friends were probably drug dealers and criminals. I mean, really. I mean, some people would laugh that off, but for him, it was a big deal. And so when he protested, they went even harder and accused him, of not having a sense of humor, the usual thing that we see. And then he withdrew. So the question there question for his boss was, is James being hypersensitive, or is he just suffering from a lack of confidence, or should he be able to take this rough and tumble, this banter? And so that was a bit of a gray area, what to do about it. And so that would be an example of, is it a gray area? Is this happening or not? And I think that looking at the intention and looking into the person's the background of both sides, actually, both James and the team, was what happened in the end.
Now, I don't know whether this is relevant or not, but I tell my children when we're referring to, is it a joke or is it not a joke? I always say to them, it's only funny if we all find it funny. And I don't know whether that applies in this situation as well, because, that thing about banter and we're just joking and so on and so forth, it can be one-sided funny, but it's not funny on the other side. So I suppose you always have to think about that. Is the person receiving the joke finding it as amusing as the person who's delivering it?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing, actually, Jane, that you didn't talk about there was claiming granting. Yeah. So if there's clear evidence that othering is happening, whether or not the person is aware of it, because sometimes they've buried themselves so far because they don't know what to do that they don't notice it's happening, but of course the line manager would. And so action should be taken in that case. I mean, in this case with James, his line manager was acting because productivity went down, basically.
Okay, interesting. And I've got to ask this. Sorry, Jane, what were you going to say?
I just wanted to pick up on your point about is it banter or is it othering? So much of humour and how it's received depends on relationship. So if you've got people, and I'm sure we've all got examples where you get on really well with them, you know them, they can say things, quite outrageous things, and it's fine because it's banter and you know the intention behind it.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the things that makes it quite difficult to generalize. When somebody feels that edge and the relationship isn't there to say it's banter, then it's misuse.
Yes, I think you're right. The context and the relationship, that intention, all of those things are, matter. I wonder if this just occurred to me. If the othering is happening at the most senior level, that has to be something that occurs, every so often. And the leader may or may not recognize that they are doing this. What is, does the process still work if it's happening there? Or is that then, maybe a culture that is, difficult to change and more challenging for us as coaches?
So there was a situation pretty similar to what you're saying there, where this was happening in a senior way, where this was a large individual who was married to a Black woman and thought that because he was married to a Black woman, he could then say all sorts of things to other Black and brown people in his office, which of course didn't go down at all well. And so I think part of it is if the individual has then been informed that actually, you might think it's funny, but actually, as you said before, when you're talking with your children, if we don't all find it funny, then it's not funny. So, if people are saying, actually, this isn't working for us, and they are carrying on regardless, then I think that is something that needs to be looked at.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now, you've talked a few times about the 3-step framework, and that's what came out of the research. I'm not going to ask you to go through that, but it's useful that you've found, a fairly simple process that we can follow, and we can work with our clients through that framework and help them and take them through it. So I wonder if you could maybe just tell me about, some of the key steps along the way. You've said the first thing really is that leaders should recognize it. That's the first thing. What then happens? How do we get under the skin of what's actually going on? What is it that we do as coaches to help our clients get beyond these situations?
Well, once we know that othering or being other is in fact happening, then we look at what is actually driving those behaviors and need to do that. So we look at the beliefs, the person's beliefs and their relationship to whatever the beliefs are. So in the case of James, for example, we looked at his beliefs and his relation to power and conflict. Right. So that was quite an important one for him because that was one of his key beliefs. then after having a look at identifying what the key belief is, we then look at, well, if this isn't working, then clearly you've either got to, it might, it's something that as coaches we call blind spots, or we call areas that people need to grow into, for example, or is that underdeveloped area. And so, do you want to begin to look at that? And if the person wants to, then the next stage is actually what kind of tools and exercises and conversations can they have to enable them to make that an easier process. Because let's not forget that when somebody is separating from something that they've believed in all their life, they might have a sense of feeling disloyal, if you like, to the place where they learned all of those beliefs and behaviors. And there might be a sense of disloyalty there. So we work with that and, enable that to just be an easier process for them. And then so carry on, please.
I was going to say, and is there a sense of loss then, in a way, around some of the beliefs that you're letting go of?
Absolutely. There is absolutely a sense of loss. And we visit that sense of loss and find out what it is that they lost, when that event happened. What did they leave behind in that place? And then, we work on it to sort of bring it up to date in the current time, so that loss is not a loss, but I grew as a result of this this thing. So yeah. So it's a growing process of letting go to something that is no longer useful, or seeing it in a different way. The third part of it is where they've done that, they've seen the belief. So James saw that his key belief that was holding him to do those behaviors was, and his team actually, was his relationship to power. And conflict, how he dealt with conflict as well is here. And so then he let go and, was able to do that very well. And then the third one is he now needs to go back to his teammates. He needs to go back to the place that he lived and come up with this new, updated, future-focused person. And so the third bit is about and helping them to transition and integrate, this new, part that they've brought with them, what they lost and left behind that they've now brought with them, and taking it, back into their membership groups, their updated things. So those are the three steps, exploring, separating, and then integrating back into their normal social environments. In this case, I'll say in this case, with James, the team as a whole also went through a similar journey. They looked at their beliefs and reassessed them, and left the ones behind that were no longer useful for them.
And I'm guessing that working on both parties is the way to do this. You can't work with one without the other. You have to do both sides, or is that not always the case?
I think it's not always the case. So with the example I shared earlier, I worked with Anita, and I was helping her to go through this process, actually. What is it she believed, and how did she actually find the evidence in herself that wasn't true, the claiming, granting that Tori was talking about. And she was able to move through that once she had sort of reestablished herself as the professional she was. So we didn't work at all with the leader. But there are times when, yes,
when you do both,
it's very important to do both if the leader's willing to do so. But if he's not or she's not, then that's an issue for the organisation, and that's where they have to decide what sort of culture they're prepared to put up with.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you both. So we're coming to the end-ish, getting close to that, and I just wondered if you could summarise for me the key takeaways from Embracing Difference. So Jane, I wonder if you could give me a sort of, what would you, if you were trying to explain this to somebody, what would you tell them about it?
I think it's recognise that this exists, that it's an important issue to address when you find it. There are some indicators in there as to what to notice, what to look for, and how to tackle that. There are the 3 stages. And it's important for the organisation as well as the individual that these issues are addressed.
Fantastic. Toy, have you got anything you want to add?
The only thing that I would add there would be that we are in an environment, have been for a few years, where the pace is accelerating, and it is really creating issues. It's creating a lot of uncertainty and so on, and accelerating, warping, if you like, in many ways. And so it is important, all of those things that Jane said, and just to recognize what is happening, recognize the context, and recognize what they're looking at, look at the lists, be able to identify, whether othering or being othered is happening, and then know what to do in terms of the framework.
Mm-hmm. And you've both given us lots of lovely case studies and illustrations, so we've got a good idea of how these things are brought to life. I'm wondering, when do you know, as a leader or as a team, when it's a good idea to bring a coach in to help navigate these types of situations in your teams? Jane, maybe you could give us an answer to that.
Yes, and I think one of the keys to this is that the exploration can be very personal.
Mm-hmm.
And you're asking somebody to really look at their own background, their own family, upbringing, social context, and dig deep into where some of these beliefs come from, where they feel vulnerable. If they're going to change some of those, they're no longer useful. And that's not always easily done internally.
Mm-hmm.
And an external coach can help both get to the root problem and therefore a solution, and accelerate it. So,
okay, great. Thank you very much. And then final question for both of you, or maybe for Toy. If people want to get a copy of Embracing Difference, how might they do that?
They can email us. There is a link, I think, on our website. There, it's easy to obtain, and yes, we're more than happy for people to find it on the website. It's there,
Mm-hmm.
and
it can be downloaded.
It can be downloaded, and there are no questions too small or complex. We're very, very open to welcoming questions on this.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vonnie.